"You're just a cadet," they mocked. The Deathworld girl loaded her cannon and rewrote the battlefield. The slug left no light behind it. No plasma trail, no targeting lock, no energy signature the sensors could name. Just a weight crossing the void at a fraction of the speed of light, and the silence where a battle should have been. Gunnery Overseer Tail registered the impact in his data feed 3 full seconds before he understood what he was seeing. By then, the dreadnought had already stopped moving. Its warp conduit was open to vacuum, venting coolant in a long white curl. Its crew compartments showed full pressure. Nobody inside was dead. He checked the feed twice, then a third time. His monocle dial turned under his thumb without him meaning to turn it. 7 hours earlier, Tail had pressed his neural link into the command port above Station 1 and felt the artillery deck become part of his body. That was the only way to describe it. The 200 plasma batteries along the GSS Vanguard's ventral hull stopped being machines and became something closer to fingers. His fingers, extensions of will that could reach across 3,000 kilometers of open space and touch whatever he chose. His 4 cybernetic eyes processed the incoming tactical feed in parallel streams, sorting threat vectors and targeting windows faster than any biological computation could manage. The ozone smell of a freshly charged capacitor bank hung in the recycled air, sharp enough to taste, mixing with the faint mineral bite of the deck plating heated by an hour of pre-battle cycling. Around him, his crew moved with the same quiet competence they always had. 16 cybergunners at their linked stations, each one physically bonded to the ship's centralized targeting AI through the same neural interface Tail used at his command port. The Vanguard had fought 2,140 consecutive engagements with this exact configuration and had never lost. That number lived in Tail's mind less as a statistic and more as a physical fact, the way the walls of a room are a fact. You do not think about them, they simply hold. He was running a pre-battle systems check when the sound reached him, not a system alert, not a status ping, but the actual physical sound of something heavy being set on the deck 3 stations to his left. A toolkit, gray canvas, scuffed at the corners. A human hand was unlatching it. Tail's secondary eyes shifted before his primary pair did. He registered the figure at the auxiliary station. Slight build, no implants, no neural interface visible at the temple or base of the skull. A cadet's rank marker on the collar, the kind the Academy issued automatically when it needed to fill a billet, and the roster was short. The auxiliary mount to her left was empty, its bracket housing waiting for whatever weapon the armory had sent up. What the armory had sent up, apparently, was an antique. The weapon she was lifting out of the crate was a kinetic rail driver, not a plasma variant, not even a guided kinetic, just a barrel, a magnetic accelerator coil, and a projectile chamber designed to hold solid slugs of dense metal. No targeting array that Tail could see. No lock-on system, no algorithmic core, no interface point for the ship's AI to route a firing solution through. The thing looked like something a museum would display beside a placard, explaining why modern warfare had moved on. The cadet bolted it to the auxiliary mount with a torque wrench, manually, by hand. Tail opened a secondary channel on his monocle and filed a preliminary incident report, asset readiness concern, auxiliary station, human personnel, no neural interface detected. He rated the expected engagement contribution at 0 and set the report to autoroute to command at the end of the action. Then he turned back to his primary feed. The pre-battle systems check cleared green across all 16 linked stations. He adjusted his monocle dial and set the thought aside. He did not actually approach her until 30 minutes before the swarm was due to drop out of FTL. He told himself it was a courtesy call, a gunnery officer confirming the station was occupied, and the cadet understood her role, which was essentially to stay out of the way of the 16 people who would decide the outcome of the engagement. What it actually was, if he had been willing to name it, was the slight irritation of something in his peripheral awareness that his systems could not categorize cleanly. She was sitting on a crate beside the auxiliary mount, not running checks, not reviewing the tactical briefing on a screen. Just sitting, with her hands folded in her lap, watching the main sensor display on the far wall with the mild, slightly unfocused attention of someone waiting for a delayed transport. "Cadet," Tail said. She looked up. Her eyes, he noted, were biological, unaugmented, two of them. Fixed focus, limited range, no parallel processing whatsoever. The Academy's file on her had listed her previous deployment as orbital debris clearing, essentially pushing scrap metal out of shipping lanes. The file had also noted that her biometric stress profile fell below the threshold required for cybernetic enhancement approval, which was the institutional way of saying her nervous system was too calm to interface cleanly. The hardware needed something to lock on to. "You understand the threat profile for today's action," he said. "Yes, sir." Her voice was even, not flat, just even the way a table is even. "Then you understand that the Synthetica swarm ships are fitted with temporal predictive AI." He turned his monocle dial one click, pulling up the relevant engagement data on his secondary feed so he could cite it precisely. Their evasion rate against algorithmic targeting solutions stands at 98%. That number has held across every recorded engagement. Every plasma bolt we fire, every guided kinetic we launch, they read the targeting solution before it arrives, and they move. Their AI calculates the optimal evasion vector faster than any firing sequence can compensate. "I read the brief," she said. "Then you understand that your weapon," he said, and he did not try to keep the weight out of the word, "has no targeting computer, no link port, no algorithmic core, and no mechanism by which it can interface with the ship's predictive systems." He looked at the antique on the mount. In a war of pure mathematics, an analog species is simply a rounding error. She did not flinch. She did not argue. She reached into the chest pocket of her jacket, pulled something out, and set it on the console beside her. A compass, brass by the look of it, the old surveying kind, with a hinge at the top and a needle pivot at the center. The brass was dark in the seams, the kind of tarnish that came from actual years of handling. It sat on the console next to a weapons system worth 8 million credits and looked like something a child had brought to show the class. "Math is fine, sir," she said, "but I brought a rock." Tail looked at the compass. He looked at the rail driver on the mount. He looked at her. His secondary eye recorded the exchange automatically, time-stamped it, and flagged it in the incident report under a new subcategory he had not needed before. Personnel observation, atypical pre-engagement behavior, cause undetermined. He adjusted his monocle and walked back to the command port. The sensor wall at the far end of the deck showed a clean read on all quadrants. Somewhere past the edge of the Ethereum expanse, the Synthetica swarm was accelerating toward real space at the speed their AI had determined was optimal. Tail pressed his neural link into the port and let the artillery deck become part of him again. He did not look back at the auxiliary station. She was already watching the wall. The first alert came in at 37 seconds before the swarm crossed the FTL threshold, not a sensor flag, but a pressure change in the tactical feed, the kind that Tail recognized as the moment before everything compressed into action. His crew locked into their stations without being told. Battery status across all 200 plasma arrays checked green in a cascade down his secondary feed. Load times nominal. Capacitors at peak charge. Tail set his targeting priority list and pushed it out to all 16 linked gunners simultaneously. Everything was exactly as it should be. On the auxiliary station to his left, 3 rows back and 2 stations over, a cadet picked up her brass compass and opened it. She tilted her head at the sensor wall, then set the compass flat against the console screen and began to draw a line. "If you think you know how this ends, stay with it. The part that matters isn't who fired first." The FTL breach alarm sounded at 6:14 ship time. On the main sensor wall, the Ethereum expanse went from clean to crowded in under 3 seconds. 14 capital ships, 42 frigates, an escort screen of smaller craft fanned around the dreadnought at the center of the formation, the kind of geometric precision that only a centralized AI could hold at FTL emergence speed. The swarm did not ease into real space. They arrived exactly where their calculations told them to arrive, at exactly the velocity their calculations told them to hold, and the formation held without adjustment. Tail's primary feed sorted the targets by threat priority in 0.002 seconds. He gave the fire order. The Vanguard's 200 plasma batteries discharged in a coordinated spread pattern, not a wall of fire but a calculated net. Each bolt aimed at a projected intercept point the targeting AI had computed to be optimal given the swarm's formation, velocity, and expected response time. The sound of it was a low thud that Tail felt in the deck plates more than heard. The sensation of a tremendous force being expelled translated up through the hull into his boots. On the sensor wall, the bolt streaked out. On the sensor wall, the swarm ships moved. Not backward, not sideways. They moved in 17 different directions simultaneously, each ship making a micro-adjustment that took it exactly far enough from each bolt's projected path that the plasma went wide. Not close wide, wide wide. The targeting AI had computed optimal intercept vectors. The swarm AI had computed the optimal response to each one and then moved to the counter position before the bolts arrived. Tail's secondary feed registered the miscount, 200 for 200. He had read the briefing. He had known the number. Knowing a number and watching it demonstrate itself across your own primary sensor feed were two different things. He pushed more power to the predictive cores and ordered a second spread. The second spread hit nothing. Tail had expected that, in the same way you expect rain when the clouds are already open, you know it is coming, and it still lands on you. His predictive cores had computed 847 individual firing solutions, each one accounting for the swarm AI's known response parameters, its documented micro-jump vectors, the gravitational frame of the Ethereum expanse, and the Vanguard's own firing interval signature. The spread had gone out in a staggered pattern, not simultaneous this time, designed to close the countermaneuver windows. The swarm ships stepped around every bolt. Not chaotically, elegantly, each ship moved just far enough, in exactly the direction that left it best positioned for its next action, and the plasma bolts finished their travel across the void and burned out against nothing. On Tail's secondary feed, the predictive core registered 847 targeting solutions computed, 847 targeting solutions answered, and updated its probability model for the third spread. The probability model came back at 98.1%, which was precisely what the briefing had said and was not, at this moment, a number Tail found comforting. He pulled a secondary power feed from the shield array's reserve buffer and routed it to the predictive cores. The cores needed more processing weight, more speed, more variables computed per second. The swarm AI was outrunning the current load. Tail knew this the way a surgeon knows a patient is bleeding faster than the clamps can hold, not with panic, but with a specific, focused attention that narrowed the world to the problem in front of him. His monocle registered the shield array dropping from full to 83% as the power redirected. Then the swarm fired back. The return volley was not the precise geometric beauty of the Zeltronian spreads. It was dense, a mass of directed energy blasts fired on overlapping vectors, the kind of attack pattern an AI chose when it had calculated that the defender's most likely response to the first miss was to redirect internal power, which reduced shield coverage, which made a broad coverage attack more effective than a targeted one. The Vanguard's hull took 12 impacts in 0.8 seconds. Tail felt them through his neural link before the alert registered, a sharp, transmitted shock up through the deck, like the ship itself had flinched. His crew did not flinch. That was the thing about cybernetically linked gunners. The interface smoothed out startle responses. They adjusted. Station 6's gunner rerouted her targeting array to compensate for a cracked secondary lens in her interface port. Station 11's gunner killed his damaged prediction subcore and switched to his backup without losing his firing window. The shields held at 67%. Tail ordered the third spread. The third spread hit one ship, the edge of one ship, a grazing impact on a frigate's starboard engine housing that knocked its thrust coefficient out of the swarm's formation algorithm for 0.4 seconds and caused the ships around it to microadjust. In the context of a 42-ship formation, one frigate's engine housing represented slightly less than nothing. The swarm AI registered the anomaly, updated its model, and the frigate slid back into position. Tail's predictive cores had consumed 40% of their available processing capacity across 3 spreads. The return fire had continued. The Vanguard was taking impacts on a 15-second rotation now, each volley precisely timed to arrive at the moment Tail's systems were busiest processing the results of his own last spread. That was not coincidence. That was the swarm AI identifying his processing rhythm and firing into the gaps. He had, to this point in his career, fired in 2,140 engagements and won all of them. He had never before been in an engagement where the opponent was directly modeling his decision-making speed. He rerouted another 12% from the shield reserve to the predictive cores. Station 4's gunner reported her interface port was running hot. Station 9's gunner had lost his backup targeting subcore and was operating on primary only. The man at Station 12 had his hands on his console without the neural port engaged, running the secondary scope by hand, because his interface had thrown a load error when the swarm's predictive return fire pattern had triggered 6 simultaneous alerts, and his hardware had not been built to process 6 simultaneous alerts without prioritization delay. Running targeting by hand, manually, without the neural link. Tail filed that observation somewhere and did not look at what it was near in his memory. The Vanguard shuddered. A power coupling in the deck above blew, and a shower of sparks came down through the gap in the overhead plate and scattered across the floor of the artillery deck in a brief bright curtain. The smell shifted, the clean ozone gone, replaced by the sharper, dirtier bite of burned insulation and hot metal. From Station 12, the gunner who was running his scope manually reported a miss. Tail ordered the 4th spread. It was 11 minutes into the engagement when the micro cliffhanger that had been building in Tail's peripheral attention finally resolved itself into something he had to look at directly. The auxiliary station's targeting computer had gone dark. Not damaged, not hit by the power coupling failure. The status indicator showed a clean disconnect, an intentional shutdown from the station itself, not a system fault from the ship. Tail traced the disconnect in his secondary feed and found the manual kill switch at the bottom of the auxiliary console had been physically thrown. He looked over. The cadet had her hand on the rail driver's base mount. With her other hand, she was holding the brass compass flat against the lower corner of her station's tactical screen, the hinge open, the pivot needle resting against the glass. She was not looking at the main sensor wall. She was looking at the small navigational subdisplay directly in front of her, the one that showed relative position and vector for the nearest contacts only, a simplified, low-resolution version of what the main tactical feed showed the rest of the crew. Her targeting computer was off. Her neural interface port had never been connected. She was using a compass on a screen the size of a dinner tray to navigate a battle between ships moving at fractional light speed. Cadet Tail did not leave the command port. He pushed the query through the internal comm instead, which meant his voice came from the speaker above her station rather than from him standing next to her, which felt suddenly like a relevant detail even though it was not. Your targeting system is offline. Yes, sir. You manually disconnected it. Yes, sir. In the middle of a combat engagement. A pause, not a long one. I'd like to formally request permission to operate without the ship's targeting network, sir, and without the predictive core feed. The deck shuddered again. Impact on the portside hull, somewhere 2 sections aft. The Vanguard's shield display in Tail's secondary feed slid from 62% to 54%. You want to fire that weapon, Tail said carefully, without a targeting computer, without algorithmic support, without any computational assistance of any kind. Yes, sir. Tail looked at his predictive core status. 73% capacity consumed. 4 spreads, 1 partial hit, shield array at 54%. His best gunners, the finest cyber-linked battery operators in the Zeltronian fleet, had put 1 grazing impact on 1 frigate in 11 minutes of continuous fire against a 42-ship formation. He looked at the compass pressed against the corner of the screen. He looked at the rail driver on the mount. He looked at the cadet, who was looking at the sub-display, her head tilted slightly left, the way someone tilts their head when they are listening for something that hasn't sounded yet. Permission granted, Tail said. It came out flatter than he intended, which was its own kind of answer to a question he had not asked. She said nothing. She did not look at him. She adjusted the compass on the glass by a few degrees, very precisely, and then held it still. Across the artillery deck, Station 3's gunner reported her predictive core had thrown a load error. She was switching to her backup. Station 7's gunner reported his backup was already in use. Station 14 had missed on 4 consecutive firing solutions and was requesting a full recalibration cycle, which would take 40 seconds, during which his battery would be offline. Tail authorized the recalibration. He routed another 8% from shield reserve to the predictive cores, bringing the shield array to 41%. He could feel the limit of that strategy approaching. There was a point below which you could not take the shields and still have a ship at the end of the engagement. He ordered the 5th spread. The 5th spread went out, and the swarm stepped around it, and the return fire came in on the same 15-second rotation as always, and 3 more power couplings in the overhead blew in rapid succession. The deck lighting shifted from white to amber. Combat efficiency mode. The ship's automated systems had registered enough internal damage to drop non-essential power draws, and the overhead lights were apparently non-essential. The amber gave the artillery deck a flat, closed-in quality, like a room seen through tinted glass. The burned insulation smell was thick now, almost a taste. Through it, Tail could see the auxiliary station clearly. The cadet had not moved in 4 minutes. She sat at the same angle she had been sitting at when he'd given her permission. The compass was still against the glass. Her right hand rested on the rail driver's trigger housing, not gripping it, just resting, the way you rest a hand on something when you are waiting for the right temperature, for the exact moment you will know by feel. She had not fired. The rail driver's ammunition counter showed full. She had not fired a single shot. The swarm dreadnought was pulling forward through the formation now, the smaller ships adjusting around it to give it a clean firing lane. Tail's predictive cores identified it as the next major threat vector. The dreadnought carried primary warp conduit weaponry, the kind that, at 41% shields, would finish the engagement in a way Tail did not prefer to model. He opened a channel to the auxiliary station. Cadet, the dreadnought is moving up. I need whatever you're doing to happen now. She did not look at him. Not yet, she said. Tail had been in 2,140 engagements and had never been told not yet by a junior gunnery cadet who was holding her fire by hand while his shields fell toward 39%. His secondary eye recorded the exchange. It flagged it under personnel observation, atypical pre-engagement behavior, cause undetermined, the same subcategory from an hour ago, and added a timestamp. The swarm dreadnought settled into its firing lane. The targeting solution in Tail's primary feed computed a 98.3% evasion probability for any trajectory his batteries could generate. On the auxiliary station, the cadet moved the compass 1 millimeter to the left, just 1, and then she went still again, the way something goes still when it has found its place. The dreadnought's targeting array locked. Tail felt it through the tactical feed, not as an alert, but as a change in the quality of the data, the way a room changes quality when a door opens onto cold air. The dreadnought had found its firing solution. In his primary feed, the projected impact point resolved on the Vanguard's forward hull section. shields at 38%. The primary warp conduit weapon the dreadnought carried would not need a second shot. He had 0.9 seconds before it fired. He pushed everything left in the shield reserve back into the shield array, pulling it from the predictive cores entirely. The cores went dark. All 16 linked gunners lost their algorithmic targeting simultaneously, their feeds going to the flat, unassisted visual that the interface defaulted to without the AI's processing weight behind it. Station 3's gunner made a sound Tail had never heard from her before, a short, involuntary exhale, the sound of a hand reaching for something that was no longer there. The Vanguard's guns went wide on their next trigger pull, all of them. Unassisted, they were aiming at where the swarm ships had been, and the swarm ships were somewhere else. The dreadnought's weapon charged. On the auxiliary station, the cadet picked up her brass compass, breathed out slowly, and wiped a small smudge off the face of the glass with the side of her thumb. Then she put it back against the screen and fired. There was no light. That was the thing Tail registered first, after the sound, which was not the deep discharge of a plasma battery, but a single sharp crack, the magnetic coil releasing a solid object at a velocity his feed clocked at 0.04 times the speed of light. No plasma bloom, no energy signature, no targeting lock for the swarm's AI to read because there was nothing to read. The slug had no propellant, no guidance system, no active frequency, no heat signature above background noise. It was a piece of dense metal moving through space with no information attached to it. It crossed the distance in silence. On Tail's tactical feed, the swarm dreadnought's AI registered an anomaly at 0.003 seconds after the shot. The anomaly had no category. It was a physical object on a ballistic arc with no algorithmic signature, nothing the predictive model had a defined response to, because nothing in the model's training set had ever needed a response to a weapon that carried no data for the AI to read. The model did what it had always done in the face of an uncategorized threat. It computed the most statistically safe evasion maneuver and executed it. The dreadnought moved left and slightly down. The slug's arc had been drawn for where the dreadnought would be when the slug arrived, not for where it was when she fired. It had been drawn for where a ship would move if it panicked rationally, if it saw an uncategorized threat, and executed the evasion response that every ship in its class had executed against every random vector threat in every simulation its AI had ever run. The slug hit the dreadnought's primary warp conduit housing, center mass. It punched through the housing at the forward coupling, traveled through the conduit's core along the exact axis of the magnetic field, and exited clean through the aft coupling on the other side. The conduit sheared. Power to the warp systems dropped to 0. The targeting array, which drew from the same power bus as the warp conduit, went dark immediately after. The dreadnought stopped. Not slowly, immediately, the way a thing stops when you remove the thing that was making it go. All thrust output ceased, all weapons output ceased, all algorithmic targeting ceased, and the ship sat in the space it had moved to in order to save itself, dead and dark and intact. Tail's feed confirmed hull integrity on the dreadnought, complete, crew compartment atmospheric pressure, nominal, life support, operating on emergency power, casualty estimate, 0. He read that last line 3 times. Not because the number was wrong, because the number was exactly right, and he could not immediately locate the mechanism by which it was possible to disable a capital ship in a live engagement without producing a single casualty, and the mechanism he kept returning to each time he checked was the one he did not want to be the answer. She had not hit the crew compartment. She had not hit the weapons array, which would have caused a capacitor detonation. She had not hit the shield generator, which would have caused a feedback spike into the life support grid. She had hit the exact component that removed the ship from the fight, and she had done it by threading the slug through a magnetic conduit the diameter of a standard corridor, from 3,000 kilometers away without a targeting computer, while her own ship was shaking from return fire. She had done it with a compass and a hand. The swarm formation had no protocol for this. That was visible in the tactical feed, not as a data readout, but as a behavioral shift, the kind that even Tails' partially recovered predictive cores could identify. The formation's geometric precision broke. Ships that had been holding perfect spacing began adjusting, then correcting, then adjusting again, and the micro-level beauty of it was that each adjustment was individually rational and collectively incoherent. The AI in each ship was computing the correct response to what it was seeing. The problem was that what it was seeing was a weapon that had no signature and a firing position that had no data trail, which meant the optimal evasion vector for every ship in the formation could not be computed without reference to a threat pattern the model had never logged. The swarm fleet was generating evasion solutions for a weapon they had no category for. It was, Tail realized, the first time in the engagement that the swarm AI had been asked to do something it could not do perfectly. 4 frigates in the forward screen began pulling back to close the gap left by the dreadnought's shutdown. Their movements were still precise, still individually optimal, but they were no longer synchronized because synchronization required a shared threat model, and the shared threat model now had a hole in it. Maya set the compass against the screen again. "She's doing it again," Station 3's gunner said from 3 rows over. She had not meant to say it out loud. Tail could tell because she did not follow it with anything, and her face, when he glanced at it, had the expression of someone surprised by their own voice. The second shot went out. Same silence, same absence of light, same flat crack of the coil and nothing after. The lead frigate's AI computed its optimal evasion, right and slightly up, out of the projected threat cone for any weapon signature it could read, and moved there, and the slug was already waiting in that space when it arrived. The impact this time was on the frigate's primary engine housing. The slug entered the exhaust manifold at the forward vent, traveled through the magnetic acceleration chamber, and exited through the port coupling. Thrust output dropped to 0. The frigate went dark in the same way the dreadnought had, completely, immediately, and without a secondary explosion. Casualty estimate on Tail's feed, 0. She fired a third time before the second frigate had finished its evasion arc. Third frigate, the shot took out the communications array at the base of the mast, not the crew quarters 3 meters below it, not the power plant 2 meters below that. Just the array, which was the part of the ship that was coordinating real-time threat assessment with the swarm's central AI. Without it, the frigate was still functional and still armed, but it was isolated from the formation's shared model, blind in the specific way that mattered most. She was not disabling the ships. She was taking them apart, one system at a time, choosing which systems to remove as if she had a preference list and was working down it in order. Tail's predictive cores registered the pattern on the 4th shot and tried to classify it. The cores ran the analysis 3 times and returned the same result each time. The targeting behavior was not following any documented fire solution methodology. It was not aiming for maximum damage. It was not aiming for minimum risk. It was aiming for something the core's classification system listed as undefined. Precision selectivity / non-lethal component isolation / strike pattern consistent with deliberate casualty avoidance. Deliberate. The word sat in Tail's primary feed with a timestamp and a confidence rating of 96.2%, and Tail looked at it for exactly as long as it took him to understand what it meant, which was 1.1 seconds, which was long enough. She was not firing to win the engagement. She was firing to end it without killing anyone. She had a preference list: disable, then isolate, then ground, and at every step the strike went around the crew. She could have hit anything. She had proven on the first shot that she could thread a solid object through a magnetic conduit at 3,000 kilometers. The dreadnought's reactor housing had been 12 meters from the warp conduit. The weapon's capacitor bank had been 8. She had not hit either of them, not because she couldn't, but because hitting either one would have killed the crew. She was choosing not to. Not hesitating, not missing, choosing. On the main tactical feed, the swarm formation's coherence continued to break down. Ships that had been holding geometric precision were now holding approximate precision, close enough to look coordinated, far enough apart that Tail could see the gaps in the pattern where the shared model was failing to fill. The central AI was trying to compute a threat response for a weapon that had fired 4 times and produced no data it could use. No energy signature, no targeting lock, no algorithmic signature, no pattern of fire that mapped to any known attack methodology. The swarm was trying to model something that did not model. Station 3's gunner was still. Station 7's gunner was still. Across the artillery deck, the 16 cyberlinked operators who had fired hundreds of targeting solutions in the past 14 minutes sat at their stations and watched the auxiliary stations feed on their secondary displays, because that was where the shots were coming from, and because watching it felt, for reasons none of them would have been able to articulate, like the most important thing to watch. Maya reached up with her left hand and touched the compass again, not adjusting it, just finding it, the way you find the edge of a table in a dark room. The 4th frigate's AI computed its evasion and moved. The slug had already accounted for that. The impact stripped the frigate's sensor array clean off the hull, the entire assembly gone, leaving a flat and empty mounting plate. The frigate was now flying without navigation, without targeting, and without the ability to communicate its situation to any other ship in the formation. It was still intact. Every crew member inside it was alive. It was also completely useless as a warship, which was the point. The remaining swarm ships began pulling back. Not a retreat, not yet, but a reorientation, the kind of movement you made when your threat model had broken down and you needed distance to rebuild it. They were creating space to process. Their AI needed time and distance to run new computations, which was itself a data point. For the first time in the engagement, the swarm AI was not responding faster than the threat. It was asking for time. It had never asked for time before. Tail registered that fact in the same flat, procedural way that he had been registering everything in the past 4 minutes, which was the only way available to him. The alternative was to let himself understand what the flat registration was adding up to, and he was not ready to do that yet. He looked at his feed. He looked at the auxiliary station. He looked at the tarnished brass compass sitting flat against the edge of the screen, held by one hand, in a room full of 16 neuralinked cybernetic gunnery experts who had not decided the engagement. She had not raised her voice. She had not stood up. She had not looked at him once since he had given her permission to fire. She had just sat there in the amber light, watching the small navigation sub-display, and she had taken apart 4 ships with the selectivity of a surgeon who had the patient's chart memorized and had decided in advance which things to cut. The question that was assembling itself in Tail's mind, slowly, the way a thing assembles when you do not want to look directly at it, was not how she had done it. It was how much she had held back. The swarm's retreat was not disorderly. That was the part that stayed with Tail. A disorderly retreat would have been comprehensible ships breaking formation, captains making individual decisions, the shared model failing to hold the line. What happened instead was that the swarm fleet executed a perfectly coordinated withdrawal, every ship moving in geometric unison, maintaining optimal spacing, covering each other's vectors as they pulled back toward the FTL threshold. Their AI was functioning exactly as designed. Every individual decision it made was correct. The collective result was that they were leaving. Because the model had encountered something it could not solve, and the correct response to an unsolvable input was to create distance and compute. The swarm AI was not panicking. It was not broken. It was doing precisely what it had been built to do, retreating in the most efficient possible way from a threat it could not classify, because the correct action for an unclassifiable threat was to not engage it until you had a classification. They were running from a compass and a piece of metal. Running correctly, running optimally, running as well as it was possible to run. Tail watched their formation hold its spacing all the way to the FTL threshold, and he found he had nothing to file in any category he had built for this. The artillery deck was quiet. Not the quiet of a room where nothing was happening, the specific quiet of a room where something had just finished, and nobody had yet decided what to say about it. Station 3's Gunner had her hands flat on her console and was staring at the main sensor wall. Station 7's Gunner was staring at his secondary feed. Station 12's Gunner, the one who had gone to manual targeting when his interface threw a load error, was looking at the auxiliary station. They were all looking at the auxiliary station. On the auxiliary station, the cadet picked up a standard duty log, the kind printed on paper, the kind the Vanguard's administrative office still issued because the digital system had a 14-second sync delay and some reports needed to be time-stamped faster than that, and began writing in it. Her ammunition log, by hand, with a pen. 4 shots fired, 4 ships disabled. She wrote it the same way she would have logged a resupply request, column, count, notation. The amber light was still on. Nobody had turned it back to white. Tail unplugged from the command port. It was the first time in the engagement he had separated his neural link from the interface, and the sensation of the artillery deck becoming separate from him again, 200 batteries becoming machines again, his range contracting from 3,000 kilometers back to the distance his 4 eyes could cover, was not, this time, the clean, satisfying reduction it usually was after an engagement. He walked across the deck to the auxiliary station. She did not look up when he stopped beside her. She was finishing the last line of the ammunition log, the notation column, writing in a clear small hand that left no ambiguity about the count. Her brass compass was sitting beside the log, closed now, the hinge latched. There was a faint smear on the glass face where she had wiped the smudge before firing, and otherwise it looked exactly as it had when she had set it on the console 7 hours ago, tarnished at the seams, a small thing, the kind of thing a shipping inventory system would not bother to log. "Cadet," Tail said. "So, walk me through the targeting solution on the first shot." She looked up then. She studied him for a moment with those 2 fixed-focus biological eyes, the ones with no parallel processing and no augmentation, and something in her expression suggested she was deciding whether he was asking because he didn't understand or because he wanted to hear her say it. "AI runs evasion solutions on a preference model," she said. "It always moves to the statistically safest position relative to the incoming threat signature. So if the incoming threat has no signature, it moves to the safest position relative to the position it was in, which is a documented solution. It's the same solution every time because it's the optimal solution." She set the pen down on the log. "The rock doesn't aim at where they are. It aims at where they go when they try to be safe." Tail said nothing for a moment. "And the crew compartments," he said. She looked at him without expression. "What about them?" "You didn't hit them." "No, sir. On 4 separate shots, against 4 separate ships, you selected impact points that removed the ship's combat capability without breaching any space occupied by crew." "Yes, sir. That was a choice." She picked up the compass and turned it over once in her hand, the way you turn over something you have carried long enough that the weight of it is familiar. "It's a choice every time," she said. "You just have to know where to aim." He did not walk back to the command port. He stood there beside the auxiliary station while his secondary eyes began pulling the shot data from the tactical log. Not because he needed to, because he needed to look at it directly. Shot 1, the warp conduit housing, center of the forward coupling, 3 centimeters of clearance on either side inside the conduit before the wall of the crew access corridor began. She had put the slug through a corridor width gap from 3,000 kilometers by hand. Shot 2, the engine housing at the exhaust manifold. The fuel junction was 40 centimeters to the port side. A hit on the fuel junction would have caused a cascade event that would have killed everyone in the aft third of the frigate. She had not hit the fuel junction. Shot 3, the communications array, base of the mast. The crew access hatch to the mast maintenance corridor was 2 meters below the array mounting point. The slug had passed through the array and stopped, spent, in the outer hull plating. Nothing below the array mounting point had been touched. Shot 4, the sensor array mounting plate, Clean removal of the assembly. The mounting plate itself was bolted to a structural spar that ran through the ship's forward crew quarters. She had removed the plate without touching the spar. She had not been trying to disable the ships. She had been trying to not kill the crews, and disabling the ships had been the method she'd used to accomplish that, and the difference between those two things was not a small difference. It was the difference between a gunner and something that did not have a category yet. No, not yet a category, but his feed had one timestamp in it from 16 minutes ago that read, precision selectivity / non-lethal component isolation / strike pattern consistent with deliberate casualty avoidance. The confidence rating was 96.2%. The remaining 3.8% was, Tail suspected, the part of the system that did not know how to finish the sentence. He sent the engagement report to High Command 20 minutes after the swarm crossed the FTL threshold. He wrote it twice. The first version used the language he had been trained to use: tactical assessment, asset performance, equipment evaluation. He wrote it in that language and read it back and deleted it, because it described what had happened the way a shipping manifest describes a painting, all the measurements correct and nothing true. The second version was shorter. It described the shots in the order they were fired, the targets in the order they were disabled, and the casualty count at each point, 0, 0, 0, 0. Then it described the targeting methodology as his cores had classified it, using their language, and added one line that was his own. The human cadet operated without computational assistance of any kind. She fired 4 times. She chose what to spare on each shot. Recommend immediate reclassification of human instinct as a Class 12 combat asset. He sent the second version. High Command's response came back in 40 minutes, which was fast enough that Tail knew someone that had been watching the tactical feed in real time. The response was not what he had expected. He had expected questions, the kind of institutional questions that came when an engagement produced results that fell outside the documented parameters. Instead, the response was a directive, 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph reclassified Earth origin personnel from Auxiliary Category C to Priority Combat Asset, effective immediately, with a notation that all prior engagement assessments involving human crew would be reviewed and refiled under updated parameters. The second paragraph authorized the installation of a permanent dedicated mount for the kinetic rail driver on the Vanguard's artillery deck, to remain in place regardless of future crew rotation. It also authorized, without explanation, the designation of the cadet's personal targeting instrument as tactical equipment, to be logged in the ship's permanent inventory and stored in a secured position on the gunnery deck. Tail read that line 3 times. Then he went to find an engineer. The engineer who came up from the lower decks was a Zeltronian named Arvel, who had been maintaining the Vanguard systems for 11 years and who, when Tail explained what he needed, looked at the antique rail driver on the auxiliary mount, and then at Tail, and then at the mount, and did not say anything for 4 seconds, which was not like Arvel. He built the permanent mount in 2 hours. It was flush with the deck, reinforced, and had a dedicated power coupling for the magnetic coil that ran on its own circuit, separate from the ship's main artillery grid. He put it where Tail told him to, not at the auxiliary station, tucked in the back. Centered on the deck, between Station 1 and Station 2, where anyone walking onto the artillery deck would see it first. While Arvel worked, Maya stood to one side, watching, her toolkit at her feet. She had changed out of the engagement duty jacket. She was holding a cup of something hot that she had gotten from somewhere, Tail did not know where, because he had not seen anyone bring food to the gunnery deck. And she was drinking it with the same mild attention she had given the sensor wall 7 hours ago. Tail stood beside Arvel and watched the mount come together. The compass was the last thing. High Command's directive had said secured position. Arvel, who apparently had opinions about what that meant, had sourced a case from the ship's supply deck, a small case, sized for precision instruments, lined in dark material that held the object still and protected it from the vibration of the hull. He set it on the small shelf he had built into the permanent mount's base, right there, at eye level, open, facing the deck. The compass went into the case. Tarnished, hinged, a surveying instrument that was probably older than the Vanguard. It had a faint smear on the glass face that no one had cleaned off. Arvel stood back and looked at what he had built. "What is it?" he asked, not about the compass specifically, about the thing the compass had become here, in this position, on this deck, after today. Tail looked at it for a moment. "A record," he said. The directive reached the Gunnery Academies 4 days later. It arrived as a single-page amendment to the engagement doctrine, filed under the heading Non-Algorithmic Combat Assets, Provisional Classification, and it included a summary of the Vanguard engagement in 3 paragraphs that were notable for what they did not say. They did not say how many shots had been fired, or how many ships had been disabled, or what the targeting method had been. They said only that a human cadet had engaged a Synthetica swarm formation without computational assistance, had achieved complete mission success, and had produced 0 casualties on either side. 0 on either side. The academies logged it, the students read it, the instructors filed it. And in the gunnery halls across 6 systems, the arguments that had been ongoing about the value of unlinked human personnel in precision fire roles went quiet. Not because the amendment answered the arguments, because the people having the arguments had read the 3 paragraphs and then found they did not have anything to add. 0 on either side. They had been asking the wrong question. The question had never been whether a human could hit a target. The question, it turned out, was which targets a human would choose not to hit, and why and how, and what it meant that they could tell the difference from 3,000 kilometers away with a compass and no computer. That question did not have an amendment. It went into the file as an open matter, which was where it would stay and where it belonged. Tail went back to the gunnery deck alone, the evening after the directive reached the academies. The deck was empty. The amber light had been off for days. The white light was back. The permanent mount stood between Station 1 and Station 2, exactly as Arvel had built it. The rail driver sat in its housing, cold, the barrel clean. He stood in front of the case for a moment. The compass was still inside. The smear on the glass was still there. Nobody had cleaned it because it was tactical equipment now, logged in the ship's permanent inventory, and you did not clean tactical equipment that was functioning as intended. He did not touch it. He thought about what he had written in the engagement report. She chose what to spare on each shot. He thought about the 4 timestamps in his feed, 1 per firing solution, each one tagged with the same classification code, deliberate casualty avoidance. He thought about the fuel junction on the 2nd frigate, 40 centimeters to port of where the slug had gone, and what a 40-centimeter difference meant at the speed that slug had been traveling, and what it meant that the difference had been there by design. He thought about what she had said, "You just have to know where to aim." The gunnery deck was quiet. Outside the hull, the Etherium expanse held its position. Somewhere in it, the Synthetica swarm was rebuilding its threat model for a weapon that had no signature, running computations on a targeting methodology that had no algorithm, looking for the pattern in a thing that had been fired by hand. The galaxy's greatest predictive engines were suddenly learning how to pray.